Hey guys, welcome back. So now we are jumping back into King in Black, and with this one I want to talk about Venom issues 32 and 33, and quite a few things in between. So let's get into it. But first, if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch the spills every week, and don't forget to hit that bell up top so we can squat up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so in our last talk on King in Black, within the main event we focused on Dylan. And back in that video I mentioned that I wanted to focus on Eddie a bit more, because when we jump back into Venom, after Eddie's death, Venom Volume 4 then takes us into the life after death concept in relation to Knull, much like what we had seen back during Absolute Carnage. And I wanted to talk about that for a bit, because when he falls and makes impact, like his consciousness just falls straight through, and where he goes from here, like on this journey, it solidifies a number of things that we'd seen before. Like in the beginning of Volume 4 when Knull had taken over the symbiote, and in a way holding the symbiote hostage within the hive while pushing Eddie out, and then also in Venom Island when the Carnage symbiote bonded with Eddie, taking over his body, and putting Eddie in a prison within this same place. And when Eddie falls through here, he thinks of these instances and he recognizes that something about this place feels familiar. And while Eddie's falling, he hears a voice telling him not to let Knull's minions drag him to hell. And this is the part that makes me want to jump back to the Absolute Carnage era. And not even so much the Absolute Carnage event itself, but more so the build up to it, like we had seen in Web of Venom Carnage Born, when we went over the different deaths and resurrections of Cletus Kasady, and how he had came back after Venomized, but also on top of that, Donny Cates had taken us back to when Cletus Kasady had first died, which was minutes after his birth, 19 minutes and 38 seconds to be exact, back in the Ravencroft Institute for the Criminally Insane. But when this had happened, your young Cletus Kasady, he had went to the Void, and when he came back, he had always remembered that experience. But it was here with your young Cletus Kasady where the Void was also referred to as hell, and described as being an endless black abyss. And even with seeing this, like in the grand scope of like all the different hells in Marvel Comics, like there's hella hells. But in addition to that, there's also a number of descriptions of the Void as well. And we've seen before where it's been referenced to as like a traveling point for some after death. And recently, well kind of recently, the first thing that comes to mind is like back when we talked about Asgardians of the Galaxy, to where back at the time Loki had reforged this tool which could resurrect the remains of those who had died in every Ragnarok ever, as well as other mythical beings. But when this happened, they had came from the Void as well. And to my understanding, like prior to Carnage Born, with the Void serving a number of purposes, it had been used very loosely over the years to be like your travel way to different realms, or even your space between splinter realms or pocket dimensions, or birthplace of godlike characters like your Chaos King for example. But in relation to Cletus Kasady and him coming here when he died, at the time, the younger Cletus Kasady, he describes that he entered this portion to where here he was caged, but even still here he could see others in the afterlife. But in his case, your infant Cletus Kasady, he didn't go any further than this point. But it's here where Eddie falls through, straight through his death, into the Void, and it's here where he hears this voice saying that he's being dragged through to hell by Knull's little minions, and it lets Eddie know that he doesn't have to be just adrift and subject to Knull's quote-unquote minions, but instead if he concentrates, he can then stick the landing and more or less navigate his way through. And it's here that we find that the voice that was guiding Eddie was the voice of Rex Strickland, who Eddie had initially met during the beginning of Venom Volume 4, with at the time him helping Eddie as a guide when Knull's avatar first arrived on Earth. And when Eddie gets here, Rex, he kind of takes on the same role, with Rex having died some time back, and with that being the case, he has a bit of a better understanding of where they are and how to navigate here. And it's here where we learn along with Eddie like what exactly this place is, with him initially acting like he's back in the real world, but then eventually realizing that he's not. And really, like as soon as Eddie got there, Rex, he initially like tried to tell him, but for Eddie it takes him phasing through some people and then having one of those dragons fly right through him until he finally slows down and he asks Rex like what's going on. And it's here where Rex tells Eddie that this place that they're in, that this is the hive, and that the two of them, in addition to everyone else that they see that's like strung up and connected, that each and every one of them are individual codex. And to put it in a way that's a bit easier for Eddie to understand, Rex just lets Eddie know that they're more like memories or ghosts. And at this point in time, like within the hive, Eddie and Rex can see that the other heroes they've been taken, because as soon as someone's bonded with the symbiote within King in Black, their codex then appears here within the hive. But for Eddie, he more or less knew most of these things that Rex was telling him, and mainly by the familiarity of where he had been from his time of death to this point. But on top of this, Rex also gives Eddie the explanation of why the two of them are able to move around unlike the others, which in a nutshell is because they've been bonded to symbiotes longer, and for that reason their codices are able to navigate through the hive a bit more freely. But with Rex confirming that they are indeed within the network of Knull's hive, Eddie tells Rex that they gotta beat this thing, because Eddie and his symbiote, they've been freed from the hive before. And because of that, Eddie knows that there is a way that this can be done. And for Eddie, one of his first ideas is to get himself, his codex, back to his body and essentially pull off the same thing that had happened with Flash Thompson when Eddie absorbed Flash's codex back in Venom issue 8 when Eddie had first met the Maker. And even though back at the time, though this didn't last too long, with Flash's codex being burnt out by Eddie's symbiote, but even with that being the case, that doesn't mean that this wouldn't work for Eddie. But when Eddie tells this to Rex, like Rex, he's just killing all kind of hopes and dreams here. And it's kind of like one of those moments where somebody's like, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but then they got some more bad news and all they have is bad news and not even a hint of a suggestion towards a solution. And that's exactly what Rex keeps doing here. And in this case, he gives Eddie the update that his body is flatlined. But when Eddie sees this and he sees his son Dylan crying over his body, Eddie then lashes out on Rex because he's not trying to hear that there's nothing they can do about this. Because for Eddie, the majority of his life has been him being pushed around because of the result of some other event. And he tells Rex here like he refuses to let his life end this way as well. And for Eddie, like it's here where he makes the point, like according to the rules which Rex had laid out, to where the longer you've worn a symbiote, the more control you have over your codex. And Eddie lets Rex know that he's worn a symbiote like actively longer than anyone else who's ever lived. And it's a good point because it's almost like, you know, like if somebody gets a game on Steam first and they play it for a little bit, but then you get it like weeks later and you have thousands of hours in that game, like your XP is going to be through the roof. And in the case of Eddie, this plants the seed that he has the better chance than anyone else who's ever wore a symbiote to do more damage here in the hive if he can just get his hands back on the Venom symbiote. And this plan, in theory, it's super powerful because now you have the idea that if someone has worn a symbiote for a long period of time, whether it's as long as Eddie's had the Venom symbiote or even something close, that now they have a potential to be a threat to the hive. And with this being a possibility, at best, you can nerf one of Knull's greatest strengths and bring him down to a playing field to where then Knull would have to fight without one of his greatest resources at his disposal. And all of that is great. But at this time, Knull is still on the throne, and Eddie doesn't even have a chance at attempting this without getting back his Venom symbiote. So for Eddie, it's not the most encouraging sight because there's a lot of hope in this plan, but step one, it's looking nearly impossible at this point. But even with this being the case, like Rex, he sees the reason within this strategy, and he lets Eddie know that he's gonna fight with them, so he doesn't have to see this through alone. But then on top of that, Rex tells Eddie that he had actually found the Venom that he had been looking for in the first place. And lo and behold, it is Corporal Flash Thompson, aka Agent Anti-Venom. And man, is it good to see Flash back. And speaking of flashback, pun intended, like for those of you who are wondering like how Agent Venom got the white symbiote and even how Flash Thompson died, I wanted to go back real quick and just kind of clear both of those up. Because back around like 2017 in Venom Inc. Alpha, and for whatever reason it feels like it was much longer ago than that, but back at the time when Eddie had got back the Venom symbiote, it was here where he was confronted by Flash who wanted the symbiote back. And at the time, the symbiote was kind of torn between the two of them, and it had bonded to the both of them at the same time. And when this had happened at Alchemax, Peter had tried to save Eddie and Flash by killing the Venom symbiote by spilling a serum on the both of them, which was derived from the original Anti-Venom, but instead of killing the Venom symbiote and preventing Flash from getting it back again, Peter had then inadvertently created Agent Anti-Venom. And I gotta say, like between the two, whether Flash was in black or Flash in white, I gotta say like the white symbiote suit looked way better. But on top of this, like when this happened, Flash had also got all the Anti-Venom abilities as far as being able to sense different toxins or even push those toxins or impurities out of the body of himself or even others. But then on top of this, as far as Flash's death, which I thought we talked about at one point, but apparently we didn't. And I think like at the time that I was going to do the video, I had then went like on this deep curve talking about Carnage and the history of the Darkhold and how the swirly line symbols had showed up before Donny Cates was using them. And because of that, we never really got into like your Red Goblin story, which will probably be a good thing to go back and visit now while there's so much going on in King in Black, because the story was pretty crazy. But just to sum up a part of it, after Norman Osborn had become the Green Goblin again, he stole the Carnage symbiote, and Peter had later called in Flash for his help. But around this time, with Flash using his Anti-Venom abilities to heal Peter, to heal Silk, and so many others, like it had taken a lot out of him. But also because of that, it had taken him a while to catch up with Peter, and when he did, he was in a much weakened state, which the Red Goblin took advantage of when Flash had stepped in and tried to take the Red Goblin down without being at 100%, which cost Flash his life, but at least gave Peter the opportunity to continue to go after the Red Goblin because of everything he contributed so far. And that's more or less like your 2-minute catch up on Flash Thompson. But jumping back over to King in Black, like it's here where Flash arrives and Eddie starts to feel something crazy happening, but he's not sure exactly what it is. And we quickly find out that it's in connection to his son Dylan. And once again, like just as a reminder, everything that we see happening here within Venom issue 32 and 33, they're playing out alongside what we had seen in King in Black. And in this moment specifically, it's around the time where we had seen Peter give Dylan a speech, letting Dylan know, like regardless of what he chooses, whether to fight or take a step back and just mourn his dad, that Peter lets him know that he's fully got Peter's support, because Peter didn't have that. And so like before, we had seen how this played out in King in Black issue 3, so it's like we know what Dylan's response is. But in this moment, like where it digs a bit deeper, and we get like the full speech from Peter Parker, and he tells Dylan like when you lose someone you love and you wish the world would stop spinning, but it doesn't stop, it just keeps going. And I just feel like it was a great addition to get that from Peter Parker on this side of the story within the scope of the event, where we get to hear more of the details of what Peter was telling Dylan, and especially with Peter telling him like the feeling of wishing the world would stop spinning right after you lose someone, because that's something that a number of us can relate to. And for me personally, it really hit home because I literally lost my mother a month ago, and that feeling is one of the things that kind of cross your mind, because with so many moving factors within life and within the world, like these things don't stop just so you can catch your breath. And I love that that is at least acknowledged here with Peter giving Dylan that option. But then on top of that, what I love even more is Dylan's response, like we had seen, to where he decided to take it head on. Because had Peter coddled Dylan in this moment, then I believe it would have hurt Dylan more than helped him. And even with saying this, like don't take me wrong, like in the case of handling grief, it's not like a definitive thing to where the solution is go hurt something. Not saying that, but instead I like the concept or idea that Dylan is going towards what's coming after him, which was also his choice of how to process this, and that's something that looks different for every individual. But with this happening during that time in King in Black where Dylan starts freeing the different heroes, Eddie also senses this within the Hive. But before we jump back to Eddie, I wanted to say one more thing about Peter real quick. Because in the case of Peter, and I'm not sure if this was like Donny Cates his intention or anything, but this is just something that came to mind. Because in the case of Peter, like aside from him relating with Dylan with losing his uncle, or as Peter mentioned, losing his parents, you also then had the case to where Peter had made a similar promise like this, like the promise he made to Eddie to protect Dylan. Like Peter had made a promise just like this, and he failed before. Because back in Amazing Spider-Man issue 90, Peter was going up against Doc Ock, and he had sabotaged his arms to cause him to go haywire, which at the time worked at taking down Doc Ock, but with doing so it was also at the high risk of civilian casualties. Because when Doc Ock's arms went on the fritz, Captain Stacy saved this little kid from getting crushed by nearby debris, which then landed on Captain Stacy after pushing the kid out of the way. And soon after, like with Captain Stacy's last words, and just to add in, like at this point, Captain Stacy, he knew that Spider-Man was Peter Parker. And on top of that, Captain Stacy, he was kind of like a next father figure and a close friend to Peter at this point. And just before Captain Stacy had passed, he had asked Peter to look after his daughter. And I'm pretty sure that everybody knows how that played out. But this is one of the things that came to mind for me recently, just with seeing the changes in Peter's demeanor, and also what seems like to be like the lack in confidence with him promising Eddie that he'll protect Dylan. But with Dylan freeing the other heroes, it isn't long before Eddie and the others, they see the other codices being released from the inside of the Hive. But on top of that, like keep in mind, like when Dylan did this, and he had like that moment where he told Knull, like I hope this hurts, and we had seen that Dylan's powers drew damage on Knull to some extent, it's also here on the flip side to where in the Hive, Eddie, Rex, and Flash, they find a rift as a result of it. And at this time with Dylan and Thor fighting against Knull, Eddie describes this rift or these cracks as like bruises in Knull's mind, or the Hive mind more specifically. But with them being within Knull's Hive at this moment, it then begs the question, like if they go through this rift, like what is on the other side? And when they pass through, Eddie tells Rex and Flash that this is the central nervous system that connects all of the symbiotes in the universe. And Eddie lets him know that this is the God Hive. And at first I was thinking like, well, how does Eddie know all this? And we'll talk about how in just a minute. But at first I did think Eddie was like, I saw it first, I get to name it. But with seeing this, it's pretty crazy, because now we're taking like one step deeper, like behind the curtain, and seeing like how Knull's powers work, which with doing so also exposes some weaknesses. Because down below them, they see the symbiotes which have been separated from the Hive as a result of Dylan and Thor going against Knull. And because their connection's been severed, they've been caged up for the time being. And on top of that, like when Flash asks Eddie, like how does he know all this? It's here where Eddie tells him that his other, the Venom symbiote, that has been reaching out to him and trying to help them along the way. Which makes sense with it being connected to Knull and being able to feed Eddie all this information. But when this happens and Eddie fills them in, Rex says it's a suicide mission, and like right after Flash is like, I'll go. And it's just kind of like, man, he good for those, ain't he? But when Flash says this, he makes the point that it was supposed to be him all along, because he was the person who Rex was originally looking for. And I mean, at the time, Eddie stepped up and did what he needed to do. And now in this moment, it's now Flash's time to step up and do his part. And initially, Eddie's against it, and he tells Flash that he shouldn't have to do this because he's a hero and Eddie's not. But Flash shuts all of that down, because everybody's got a past. And if you think about it, even Captain America, because like, didn't he lie on his military application? But that's aside from the point. And really, like, it's in this moment where Flash says something that's so profound, because he tells Eddie, like, in spite of all that you've done, you're here now, and you're storming the gates of hell, trying to save the world and rescue your son. But the part of that really gets me is where Flash is like, Eddie, you are a hero, but let me be a soldier. And when Flash said that, I was like, oh man, Flash, you giving Captain America a run for his money with these speeches. But after Flash says this and he jumps down, guns blazing, he then gets his hand bit off by one of the dragon symbiotes. But even when this happens, he's close enough to let off a grenade, freeing the imprisoned symbiotes, but also ticking Knull off in the process. And when this happens, we see the freed symbiote go for Flash, and Rex is just like, oh no, they gonna kill him. But Eddie's like, nah, because he realizes the plan is working. And right after, we see Flash rise in his anti-venom dragon symbiote. And with seeing this, I can't help but think, like, over a period of time, like, certain characters just deserve an upgrade. And Flash Thompson is definitely one of those people. And I can't wait to see like how crazy this gets for him moving forward, like even beyond King in Black. But from here, I'm guessing the plan is for them to ride on the dragon in like a never-ending story type of fashion, just with an anti-venom dragon in this case. But at the moment, that plan's gonna have to wait, because as soon as this happens, Knull shows up and he grabs Eddie. So in order for them to find a way out of here, they gotta get through Knull first. And because of what we had seen Flash do just now, we know that Eddie's plan to get back his other, it has a good chance of working. And so now real quick, I want to give a special shout out to all the Patreons. Thank you guys for your support. And for anyone who's new here who wants more information on how to support the channel, I got a link below to where you can go to patreon.com/DopeSpill. But that'll do it for this one, guys. Like, I got a feeling that we're gonna get a badass version of Venom, like a badass return of Venom at some point in this story. Because as far as upgrades go, Carnage got a nice one during Absolute Carnage, Flash just got a nice one, but now I feel like it's Eddie's turn to go sicko mode. But let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and we'll do it again on the next one. Alright, later.